Right. Snorri's Edda is a unique document, I think, in any field of religion, in that it preserves more information about the religious tradition it treats of than any other source, while being written from outside that faith and from another whose dogma was that this religion was false. But that today serves as one of the principal means to establish what was true about this so-called false religion. And to some extent, the same paradoxical problem besets the poetic Edda, whose words were committed to parchment seemingly by Christians over 200 years after the religious tradition to which the words bear witness had been rejected. Völuspá, one of the poems of the poetic Edda, it seems to me, declaims its prophecy in a voice learned and strident in an attempt to cover up an uncertainty out of a pagan culture in a crisis of identity that no longer seems to have believed in itself, certainly if one compares it to the tones of the Rig Veda. To read Snorri as a source for Ásatrúar seems to me like trying to unravel a vivid medieval tapestry and pick out the original threads that were the inherited raw material from the patterning derived from the Christian context in which it was woven, and from the results of the weaver's own poetic embellishments and desire to produce a picturesque narrative replete with certain regularities and symmetries. A further complication is the range of individual beliefs that may fall under the pagan and Christian denominations, inasmuch as both are expressions of a general human religious sensibility. One may find parallels, perhaps, within the classical world for all of the Christian theology Snorri imports. For example, Zeus is described by some as the principal controlling force of creation in a similar way to how Snorri describes the head of the Norse pantheon, Odin. This is from Cleanthes' hymn to Zeus, written about 250 BC. Nature's great sovereign, ruling all by law, thee obeys this vast whole cosmos, wheeling round the earth, and where thou leadest, it follows, willingly ruled by thee. So I think the approach I would recommend to reading Snorri, after reading an appropriate historical introduction to the material, is to try to put aside dichotomies like pagan true, Christian false, and instead to submit the narrative to one's deeper intuition about what corresponds with nature, what corresponds with reality as one believes it to be, and one's own sense of the divine. With that, I very warmly invite Mathias to speak, and I apologise profusely for all the messing about with leads, but the show will go on, and please, sir.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me all right? I'm hearing some noise. All right, everyone can hear me all right, and there's no okay, good. So I have created a PowerPoint to share with you all, and I will just share my screen so that you can see it. I hope that those of you who are sitting in the room will also be able to see what I have written on the PowerPoint, but I will also share it with you so that you have it for reference for later. So let's get on with it. Okay. All right, so my approach here is basically to talk about how to approach and read Snorri's Edda, keeping in mind the perspective from which he originally wrote the story. And I'll give an introduction to both the text and also a little bit about biographical background and also, of course, components of the content. And to those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Mathias Nordvig. I have a PhD in Old Norse mythology, and I'm the director of Nordic studies at the University of Colorado Boulder in the United States. The content of this presentation will focus on first an introduction to Snorri's Edda, then we will talk about the prologue in Snorri's Edda, then the large section, the first large section called the delusion of Gylfi or Gylfaginning. After that, I will talk about the language of poetry, the second large section of the poetic Edda, Snorri's Edda, which is called Skáldskaparmál. After that, I talk about the role that Eddic poetry and Skaldic poetry play in this material. And after that, I have some comments on the story frame in the delusion of Gylfi. The delusion of Gylfi, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is that's really the main source to Nordic mythology. If you look things up on Wikipedia or look things up in a popular dictionary, it will usually be the material from that portion of Snorri's Edda that is represented there. And after that, I of course have some concluding remarks, and I hope we can have a conversation about the presentation as well, for those of you who have questions. So to go ahead, Snorri's Edda was composed in 1220 as a literary treatise on Skaldic poetry. Snorri created the book after his journey to Norway in 1218. And during his journey to Norway, Snorri complied with the tradition that has existed since the Viking Age and composed a Skaldic praise poem in honor of the Norwegian king that he visited, of course. Now, many Icelandic sagas make use of this theme, and judging from the prevalence in the saga literature in general, this seems to have been one of the most important forms of cultural currency in the North Atlantic world. Now, both Danish historian Saxo and the Norwegian historian Þjóðrekur mention the literary and artistic ingenuity of Icelanders as part of how they're talking about the Icelandic craft of Skaldic poetry. Now, the custom had been a particular hallmark of prominent Icelanders visiting Scandinavia since at least the early 900s. And part of a young man's upbringing in Iceland was to learn the art of Skaldic poetry. This was really important as a cultural upbringing. So when he came to Norway, Denmark, Sweden, or even the British Isles, it was expected that he would approach the king and present him with a praise poem. We're of course talking about elite Icelanders. It's not every peasant that you find in Iceland, but elite Icelanders. And the king would then repay the honor with a gold ring. Now, the Icelander would then return to Iceland with gifts that he had received from the king, including the fame that came with all of this, of course. So Snorri Sturluson was born in 1179 and died in 1241. He was an Icelandic magnate who rivaled, among others, his own brother Sighvatur in an attempt to establish himself as the most powerful person in Iceland. His interest in liaising with the Norwegian king and earl in 1218 was certainly related to these rivalries that he was involved in. And this is also part of the background for understanding what Snorri Sturluson's Edda actually is. And the same could be said for his interest in literature. Aside from his Edda, it is possible that Snorri also authored, at least in part, the collection of the Norwegian king's sagas known as Heimskringla. It is, you will usually see, if you pick up Heimskringla, you will usually see that it says it was authored by Snorri Sturluson, but this is in fact disputed. And some scholars really will say that he did not write the collection of Norwegian king sagas at all, but I'm sort of on the fence with that subject, just to clarify that little point. So his interest in Norwegian history was not just intellectual, and that's really important to consider, right? Because that means it tells us something about why he would author a book on skaldic poetry as well. Now moving to Snorri Sturluson's Edda itself, the first thing is that the Edda exists in 4 extant versions in medieval manuscripts. We don't have Snorri's original version from 1220. The oldest one that we have is the Uppsala Edda, which is at the University Library in Uppsala in Sweden. And that one is about 80 years younger than Snorri's original text. And of course, there are differences between these 4 versions that we have. So that also means that we can't always trust the content, so to speak. They have been copied and written down in different contexts by later scribes. And part of any redactor's job is, of course, to find sort of a middle ground between all these 4 versions. And some would even, cast certain versions aside and say that they have nothing to do with Snorri's original text. But from all of this, we can deduce that the content of Snorri's Edda is a prologue that introduces to the material, then the chapter, the delusion of Gylfi, then the chapter, the language of poetry, and then finally this long skaldic poem that was at least started by Snorri when he was in Norway, and which is called Háttatal, the enumeration of meters. So Snorri composed at least parts of this poem in Norway, as I mentioned. And after returning to Iceland, he then wrote this poem down and added the language of poetry to explain the kennings and heiti, which are basically circumlocutions and analogies from skaldic poetry. And then he added the delusion of Gylfi as a more complete frame for explaining Nordic mythology. And finally, he added a prologue as a Christianized frame for all of this. That doesn't mean that the rest of it is not also impressed with the Christian thoughts, of course, which I will get to. So this means that the 4 parts of Snorri's Edda were not written at the same time. Háttatal, the enumeration of meters, was created first, probably as an oral poem, and then it was written down later and also expanded to basically demonstrate all the different elements of skaldic poetry. Skálskaparmál, the language of poetry, was written afterwards to explain the kennings in the poem. And Gylfaginning, the delusion of Gylfi, was written after Skálskaparmál, perfecting the form of a question-answer setting where the gods answer questions from this curious learner. In Skálskaparmál, it's Ægir, this presumed giant who is asking these questions, whereas in Gylfaginning, it is the Swedish king Gylfi who is asking these questions. And then finally, Prologus was written after Gylfaginning, and its purpose is to set the right frame and understanding for the content of the following sections, of course. So while Snorri was not a man of the church and presumably did not know Latin, so he would not be able to read theology and philosophical treatises in Latin, of course. It is clear that he was familiar with a wide array of interpretive methods employed by the Christian intellectuals of his time. And he might also have had access to translated works on learned Latin material and theology. So what we can see from his Edda is that he operates with the notion of universal Christian history. He employs etymology in its as sort of a descendant type of etymology from Isidore of Seville as a major theoretical or methodological approach. And also he makes avid use of euhemerism, the basic theory that gods are in fact humans. So this is really important for understanding what type of text he's actually writing. And what does the prologue to Snorri's Edda actually say? Well, first of all, we can divide the prologue into 6 portions based on the different subjects that it treats. We have universal Christian history, basically the origin of humanity, which starts with Adam and Eve and proceeds with the Noah's flood and all of that stuff. This is how he begins Edda. Then he gives us a theory on non-Christian religions and explains to us from a Christian perspective how non-Christian religions came about. After that, we have universal Christian geography and the story of Troy. And then we have the genealogy of the Aesir and the migrations of the Aesir from Troy. And then we also get a snippet of Snorri Sturluson's theory of language. So what these different subjects address is basically certain aspects of learned Christian knowledge. We have Christian history, we have Interpretatio Christiana, basically the interpretation of other religions from the perspective of Christianity. We have Euhemerism and the genealogy of peoples as we know them from biblical material with Sem, Ham, and Japhet. Then we have the migrations of peoples, which is a reference to the 12 tribes. And then we have etymology as a reference to the fall of the Tower of Babel. And this is really important for how Snorri is framing his understanding of Old Norse mythology. So the frame is universal Christian history. God created the world, humans came from Adam and Eve. God sent a deluge to punish those who had strayed from his laws and began to worship Mammon, basically wealth and possessions. Then Noah repopulated the world after the deluge, and people lived according to God's laws for some time. After that, people then forgot the name of God and began to worship Mammon again. And this is the whole theory too, the foundation of the theory of non-Christian religion, that it's based in materialism. So what he says is that even though that they had strayed from God's law and therefore lost spirit, God still let humanity have logic and reasoning, and people therefore produce their own, and this is from Snorri's perspective, pagan explanations for how the universe functions. So lacking spirit and therefore the ability to really see what the world is, from Snorri's perspective, pagans then came up with 2 theories about how the world functions. Some divine controller is in charge of the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. And Earth must be alive and ancient because it has the same qualities as any animal or human for that matter. Water springs from the ground in the mountains and in the low grounds, just like blood comes out of the skin on the head and the toe of a human being, and so on. And then he tells us that the pagans began to worship Earth and this divine controller, and they counted their lineage from Earth. Now, moving on to his explanations for the geography, he basically uses the typical medieval mappa mundi. They're also known as the TO maps because they look like an O with a T in it. He tells us that the world is divided in 3 portions. We have Asia, Europe, and Africa. And in the middle of the world, the Mediterranean separates Europe from Africa, while the river Tanais and the Arabian Sea separate Asia from Europe and Africa. The center of the world, where we find Jerusalem, is the most beautiful and the richest part of the world as well. And this is also where we have ancient Troy located in what is also known as Asia Minor. And that's the origin of why people in Scandinavia eventually begin to worship these Aesir, men of Asia, as Snorri claims they are, because they have so many riches that they have taken from when they left from Troy. So we get sort of a vague reference to the Trojan War and the collapse of Troy, And then what we see is Odin migrates from Troy with all his men from Asia, the Aesir. And what he does first is that he goes, he migrates sort of like through Central Europe into what is now Germany, and he places his son Sibdager as king in East Saxony. We have Baldur in Westphalia. We have Siggi in Frankland, which is France, and he places Skjoldur in Jutland in Denmark. Then he goes to Sigtuna and establishes this place as his capital, with the, as Snorri says, with the same laws as they had them in Troy. And then he places his son Sæmingur in Norway, and Yngvi becomes king in Sweden, in Uppsala. And what Snorri also tells us is that these men of Asia, this is part of his etymology, right? He turning Aesir into men of Asia. Married local women, and thus the language spread across northwestern Europe. And he notes that the languages in Saxony, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden are similar. And he also notes that in England, there are place names that are close to this language too. And I don't know if that is because he has some awareness of some of the old Scandinavian place names in England, or what is going on here. But that's what he says. So I find that quite interesting. And then, of course, Snorri and his contemporaries called this language the Danish tongue. So that's how this the theory of how Nordic mythology actually comes into being is explained by Snorri. Moving on to the delusion of Gylfi as this main part that tells us about Nordic mythology. So what we have here is a story where the protagonist is a legendary king named Gylfi. He's heard about the gods, or the Aesir, who have migrated there to Sweden, and so he goes and first he disguises himself as a traveler named Gangleri. That's an Odin name. And he goes to the Aesir, enters the great hall, and encounters these three men named High, Even High, and the third, and they speak for the Aesir. Now, they have already sort of like realized that Snorri is on his way. Sorry, not Snorri. Gangleri is on his way. So they have prepared, as Snorri tells us, some visions for him, and made this hall look much cooler than it is, and those kinds of things. And so he's already very impressed when he gets there. And then Gylfi has this question-answer contest with these three men, which becomes basically the frame for relaying the mythology in the delusion of Gylfi. So the story in Gylfi mimics the typical Christian missionary strategies employed in the medieval period to demonstrate to non-Christians how their stories are mistaken. This is we know this from multiple literatures, how missionary strategies would basically employ these question-answer situations where we're asking non-Christians, well, who is the creator of the world? Where does wind come from? How was the sun and moon created? All of these things. And this is actually the same pattern that the delusion of Gylfi follows. So they basically drive at the core of knowledge of the cosmos, and with this, missionaries would attempt to demonstrate to non-Christians that their stories, if they had any, were wrong, simply by asking these questions. And this is also because quite often you find in indigenous mythology is that these subjects aren't particularly important, because the focus is more on ritual action in different ways. So what do we see in terms of like subjects that are being treated in the delusion of Gylfi? First of all, we are being asked, who is the highest of all gods? And this is already a contentious issue, because the question is raised if Ymir, this primordial giant that the world was created from, if he is a god that these Aesir are worshiping. So so already there we also get some confusion in terms of like who are actually gods in all of this, and that's a really important issue too. Personally, I actually think that Snorri is deliberately vague about this. So the next thing that happens is that we're asking what were things like before there were humans, and that's when we get the story about the frost giants and the creation of the world from Ymir's body and all that stuff, which also includes a Neoplatonic theoretical component of the elements that create all of this, like the fire and ice and all that stuff. Then we get to the story of the creation of humans, and this is really interesting. The creation of humans is immediately followed by placing Odin as Allfather in this little cosmos, as the progenitor of all of humanity. It is interesting to see how Snorri basically casts Odin and the Aesir, who all descend from him, as sort of like just a human super race more than actual gods. And he says also that they all live the same place. And again, we get a reference to Troy here. He says that Ausgarður, the home of the gods, is also Troy. Then we get to the subject of night and day. How did that come about? The sun and the moon. We get the wolves involved here as well. And there are these descriptions of the way to heaven and how heaven is organized. And then we get to Allfather's laws, which are presumably the same as the ones that were in Troy. After that, we get the description of the dwarfs and the world tree and the assembly. And if you're familiar with the poem Völuspá, or the prophecy of the seeress, you can see that there is sort of he's using that poem as a timeline for the cosmos as well. We get the world tree and the assembly, as I mentioned, and then we get to the Norns, the goddesses of fate that reside at the base of the tree. He talks a little bit more about the world tree, and then he talks about places in heaven, the winds, and summer and winter. And then he gets to the gods, and he mentions Odin, and then he mentions Thor, Njörður, Freyr, Freyja, Tyr, Bragi, Idun, Heimdallr, Höður, Vidar, Ullr, Forseti, and Loki. So in total, what we have are 12 gods and Freyja, who are mentioned here in this progressive line. And this focus on 12 male deities with Odin seems to reflect, again, sort of more of a Christian idea of the apostles than anything else. We get very few details about these gods, like Ullr, for instance. He has 2 lines, and that's it. Forseti is the same. Loki, on the other hand, is of course more described here, because after Loki is first mentioned, then we progress to the story about his children, Hel, of course, and then the story about how the Fenrir wolf bites off Tyr's hand. And of course, the Midgard serpent is also briefly mentioned here. The interesting thing is that Snorri is almost verbatim quoting biblical material in his descriptions of what Allfather does with the Midgard serpent. He casts it into the deep sea, and he assigns Hel to the underworld. After that, there's an explanation for who the Asinir, the goddesses are. He tells us about Frigg, then Saga, Gefjun, Futla, and Freyja again is mentioned. And then Sjón, Logn, Vargur, Sýn, Hlín, Snotra, and Now. And these last ones from Sjón and onwards, they're basically just based off of etymology. And several scholars are quite convinced that they're actually not actual deities, but it's simply just inventions. Now, of course, one could, then debate for a very long time why are they invented in this way and so on. But that's just to keep that in mind. Then he goes on to tell us about other beings. We have the Valkyries. We have Freyja and Skitnir, that little story about how Freyja sends his servant Skitnir to go get the goddess Gerdur. And Snorri uses this story for one purpose, and that is basically to explain why Freyja does not have a sword at Ragnarök. After that, we get the furnishings of Valhöll. We have Odin, we have the Einherja, and all the partying with pork meat that never depletes, and all the meat you can drink, and all of those things. Then we get to sort of like more of like myth telling. After that, he tells us the story about the master builder and how Loki became a mother of Sleipnir. The interesting story, the interesting thing about the story is that it basically tells us why the rampart around Ásatrúar, which we should remember is the same as Troy, was actually incomplete, which is why it could be breached by invaders in the first place. The next thing to happen is that we get a brief description of Freyja's ship Skidbladnir, which is said to be the best ship there is. And this is interesting because this leads to a discussion about all the good things that the gods have, and especially also if anybody has ever failed, or if there are things that are not that how would you say that? There are things that didn't work out mythologically in different ways. And that's where they try to stall. The three Aesir, they try to stall the situation and basically go, we're not really interested in telling you about this. And Gylfi is like, if you don't give me stories about how Thor has failed, I will declare myself the winner of this contest. And that's how we then get the story about Thor's journey to Utgarðaloki. The interesting thing about this is that in the beginning of Gylfaginning, when Thor is first introduced as Odin's son, we are told that nothing living can best him. And now, later on, sort of in the middle part of this narrative, we're getting stories about how he was bested. And this is the story about Utgarðaloki. He goes to Utgarðaloki, where he is put to these tests. First of all, the most important first detail is that Thor and his entire company are small, and they are interacting with these giants that are then putting him through these different tests. The most important one is, of course, his wrestling match with Ekli, whose name means old age, where he's brought to a knee. Right, so this more or less contradicts that initial statement that he can't be bested by anything living. Of course, this then brings us to another question: is like, what is Utgarður? Because it's not the same as where the giants live. It's not Jotunheimr. It's something we're told this in the story directly. It says they first come to Midgarður, then they come to Jotunheimr, and then they cross the deep sea and go to Utgarður. So like we're dealing with some kind of out of space journey here. And if we look into the narrative itself and what it generally seems to relate to, is actually the vision literature of the early medieval period, where this is a whole genre of literature where different kinds of important, notable people are sent to hell, and sometimes also to heaven, to understand God's order. And there's something to be said for a relationship between this narrative and that type of literature. We may also note that in this narrative, it seems like Snorri is actually using some East Nordic vocabulary. There's something that, among other things, the word hanski, which means glove, is being used here. And that one did not seem to exist in Snorri's Old Norse, but it does exist in East Nordic at the time. And this is interesting because that might suggest that this narrative actually comes from the East Nordic part of Scandinavia. And it could be Danish, it could be Swedish, we don't really know. But what that might suggest is, in fact, that it's an old missionary narrative that is part of deconstructing Thor as a deity in that syncretic period. Anyway, moving on from there, what we see next is that Thor goes and fishes for the Midgard serpent. He does this because he's pissed off. When he realizes that he has been bested by Utgaraloki divulges all of this information. He says, "Oh, we've tricked you." He tries to beat Utgaraloki, but he throws a smoke bomb but disappears, right? And so Thor, in an attempt to avenge himself, then goes to fish for the Midgard serpent in Snorri's version. And what we learn here is that what the narrator tells us is that Thor actually, there are some people who say that Thor had success in catching the Midgard serpent and killing it, but he still believes that it's out there. This is an interesting little bit because this tells us basically that there might be some ambiguity in terms of whether or not Thor killed that serpent. And this might have something to do with existing narratives. There are multiple narratives about this fishing expedition. We have skaldic poetry that refers to it. We have picture stones in England, in Sweden, in Denmark, and so on. We have an Eddic poem that is later than Snorri's Edda, presumably. And then we have Snorri's version. And Snorri's version is actually probably built on an oral story that we have now lost, because he, as the only version of this story, aside from the picture stones, mentions the feature where Thor's feet go through the boat and he stands at the bottom of the ocean. We can see this in the picture stones. If you look at the Altuna stone from Sweden, you can very distinctly see Thor's boot having gone through the bottom of the boat. But this is not mentioned in skaldic poetry, and it's not mentioned in the Eddic poem either. So Snorri seems to have had another source available to him, which is really, really interesting. This also is, of course, a hint that Snorri actually knows more than the literature that we have available to us. But the interesting thing about this story about the Midgard serpent is, of course, that he casts this as an example of how Thor once again fails. And then we get to Baldur's death, which is, again, a very dramatic, even traumatic story, right? About the death of the best of all the gods. Baldur is said to be the best of all the gods. So he was, of course, supposed to stay alive forever. That's why there's the attempt to immortalize him by his mother, Frigg. But then he is killed by something as ridiculous as the mistletoe, which also carries certain import, that it's the mistletoe, a plant that you can't really fashion an arrow out of. And this portion of the story then rolls over to the punishment of Loki, the capturing of him, and then of course Ragnarök. And Baldur's death is what sets off Ragnarök in Snorri's perspective, but perhaps also in the perspective that is presented in the prophecy of the seeress, because it does seem that that is the same idea of a timeline represented there. And then after Ragnarök, when everything has crumbled, we get this epilogue where the Aesir, after they have basically thrown a smoke bomb, just in the same way as Utgaraloki did to Thor, they do this to Gylfi and disappear, and then they sit down somewhere, and then they decide to apply these stories and names to the land there, and that's presumably in Sweden or in Scandinavia in general. And so this is part of Snorri's theory of like how all of these stories became the basis for religion in Scandinavia. All right, so moving on to the language of poetry. This is also a similar like frame story. It's just not as complete or as successful as the delusion of Gylfi. What we have here is a banquet at this man named Ægir or Claes hall. The gods have come to visit and they're having a feast. Now, the gods that are present there are Odin, Thor, Njörður, Freyr, Tyr, Heimdallur, Bragi, Vida, Vali, Kullur, Hænir, Forseti, and Loki. And we also have the goddesses Frigg, Freyja, Gefjon, Idun, Gerður, Sigyn, Fulla, and Nenna. And if we're familiar with the poem Loki's Quarrel or Lokasenna, we may see that there is some correlation here. Again, it's like a banquet, it's a feast that is the scene for some of these events. And in this, at this feast, what we have is a conversation between Bragi, the god of poetry, and then Ægir, who is asking these things about skaldic poetry. And basically, he's asking basic questions like, about how you compose kennings and Haiti and so on. And that's how we get different stories. So the stories that are told in, and these are of course some of the main myths that we know as well, are first of all the story about Thjazi and him kidnapping Idun. The second one is the meat of poetry, so the origin of poetry. Then we get a curious epilogue where there is where Snorri tells us a little bit about poetry and circumlocutions and what poetry is for, and also strongly warns against believing in these stories in anything else than as stories that refer to the events in Troy. That's something that he says very specifically. And then we get a reference to the story of Troy again. And we get it's basically Snorri's theory for how this works. He tells us that Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent is in reality an allegory for Achilles trying to goad Hector with the head of an otherwise unknown figure named Volocrontus. So this is quite interesting, because there we get sort of like the basis for Snorri's entire understanding of the mythology. Then he goes on to talk about kennings for gods and the meat of poetry. We get the story about Thor and Hrungnir's duel. And then we get the first half of the skaldic poem Haustlong. Then we get the story about Thor and Geirröður. And then we get the skaldic poem Þorstrápa. After that, we have the second half of the skaldic poem Haustlong. And then we get a long list of kennings. Then we get the story about Loki and the dwarves, more kennings, the story about Sigurd and the dragon slayer. And then the skaldic poem about Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnarstrápa. We have the story about Frodi's mill, Grotti, and then the song Grotti. And then we have the story about Hrólfr Kraki, more kennings, and the story about Högni and Héðinn, including more kennings, with also many kennings about Christ, that refer to Christ. And then we have a list of Haiti as well. And so that's really the content of his Edda, aside from the skaldic poem Ásatrúar, that I've decided not to include. So what is the role of Eddic poetry in Snorri's Edda? He makes ample use of Eddic poetry. And Eddic poetry is almost exclusively used in the section, The Delusion of Gylfi, where it functions as sources for his interpretation of pre-Christian Nordic mythology. There are a few stanzas that have been quoted in the section, The Language of Poetry, which are also composed in Eddic-related meter. However, we should realize that when it comes to separating Eddic and skaldic poetry in Höstlung and Thorstrápa, it gets really iffy. So that's something to keep in mind. However, the majority of poetry quoted in the section uses skaldic meter in general. Now, the Eddic poems that can be verified as sources to Snorri's Edda are the Prophecy of the Siras. He quotes most of that poem. Grimnir's sayings, Vathunir's sayings, the sayings of the High One, and Loki's quarrel. And he also has a brief reference to Skirnir's journey, in the sense that he does reference parts of that story of how Freyr lost his sword. Now, Snorri most likely had a manuscript containing Eddic poetry available to him when he wrote Edda in 1220. The manuscript that he used does not exist any longer, and it is possible that it was written as early as the middle of the 12th century. Now, this opens a door to the idea that the Codex Regius, which is containing the main parts of the Eddic poems, may have been based on an older manuscript that was written sometime before Snorri's lifetime. It is obvious that Snorri quite often quotes Eddic and skaldic poems out of context in his text. In the beginning of the Delusion of Gylfi, he quotes a skaldic stanza that makes cryptic references to the goddess Gefjon claiming a piece of land called Denmark's extension from a figure named Gylfi. Now, Snorri uses this information in the poem to claim that this land is Zealand and that Gefjon plowed it out of the location where the Lake Mela now is in Sweden. Moreover, it seems straightforward that Snorri only uses this stanza to build his character Gylfi up as a dim-witted Swedish king. This is really important to keep in mind. He basically introduces Gylfi as kind of an idiot. And this is part of, again, of the idea that that Nordic mythology is lies and if nothing else, flawed theories about what the world is. So throughout the Delusion of Gylfi, Snorri makes use of Eddic poetry as an ancient poetic source that can authenticate claims that he has the three Aesir, high, even, high, and third, make. They give descriptions of the cosmogony, cosmology, gods, and their role in the mythology. Their claims are followed up by quotations from poems, and that's usually the Prophecy of the Siras. In some cases, it is obvious that Snorri takes great liberties in his interpretations. In chapter 5, Snorri explains that the primordial being Ymir is also called Örgelmir, because that is what the Jötnar, or giants, call him. What he does there is that he fuses information from several poems, including the descriptions of Ymir in stanza 3 of the Prophecy of the Siras, stanza 21 from Vathunir's sayings, and stanzas 40 to 41 in Grimnir's sayings. Then he claims that the figure Ymir is the same as the figure Örgelmir, who Vathunir says came from the river Elivaugar in stanzas 29 to 31 in Vathunir's sayings. And basically this forms the basis for his creation myth, with a dash of Neoplatonic elementary theory too. So Snorri's way of using Eddic poetry as a source for his narrative in the Delusion of Gylfi in particular is certainly not true to the original content of the poems. In chapter 7, he replicates the biblical myth of the deluge, God's flooding of the world, by quoting stanza 35 in Vathunir's sayings, which recounts the origin of the figure named Bergelmir, who was eventually laid in a coffin. Now, this is probably signifying the end of Bergelmir's lifespan in that poem, but Snorri claims that the reference to a coffin is in fact an ark, like Noah's ark. And this enables him to then represent Bergelmir as sort of like a demonic Jötun Noah figure in Nordic mythology. Now, when compared with Snorri's prologue into Edda, the purpose is very clear. Snorri is aligning the timeline of Nordic mythology with Christian universal history. He manufactures instances from the pre-existing literature and poetry to fit what he understands to be the truth about the world, basically the Bible. And moving on from there, let's talk a little bit about what he does with skaldic poetry. So the use of skaldic poetry in the first part of Edda, the prologue, and the delusion of Gylfi is very limited. It seems clear that Snorri had a different idea about what kind of source skaldic poetry was compared to Eddic poetry. The section that presents skaldic poetry in Snorri's Edda is the language of poetry, and Snorri explains the circumlocutions, the kennings, and the heiti particular to skaldic poetry in this section. The presentation takes the form of thematic sections where a certain circumlocution or set of circumlocutions are being explained by the use of mythic narration. This use of mythic narrative and poetry is different from the delusion of Gylfi, where Snorri would first present a claim about the mythology and then back it up with a poetic reference. He largely does the opposite in the language of poetry, where he presents a poetic form and describes it through mythic narrative afterwards. An example of how Snorri approaches the relationship between poetry and mythic narrative is a dialogue between Bragi and Ægir that occurs right after the section's first story. Bragi replied, and I quote, his, that would be Fjatsi's, father was called Ölvaldi, and you will find what I have to say about him remarkable. He was very rich in gold, and when he died and his sons had to divide their inheritance, they measured out the gold when they divided it by each in turn taking a mouthful, all of them the same number. One of them was Stjatsi, the second Idi, the third Gangr. And we now have this expression among us, to call gold the mouth tail of these giants, and we conceal it in secret language or in poetry by calling it speech or words or talk of these giants. Then spoke Ægir, this seems to me a very good way to conceal it in secret language. And Ægir went on, how did this craft you call poetry originate? And that's how we get the story about the meat of poetry. So after recounting the story of the meat of poetry, Snorri then goes on to explain the basic elements of poetry through the mouth of Bragi, again as the narrator. There are two categories in which all poetry is divided. Language and verse forms. There are three categories in the language of poetry. To call everything by its name. The second category is one called substitution. And the third category of language is what is called a kenning, which is a description. For instance, when we speak of victory tier or hanged tier or cargo tier, these are expressions for Odin, and these we call periphrastic terms. Similarly, if one speaks of charioteer, Thor. Underlying Snorri's explanation of skaldic poetry is also the assumption that it is in fact a reliable source for actual historical knowledge, whereas Eddic poetry is more a misunderstood historical knowledge or allegories for the events at Troy. So in Heimskringla, the collection of Norwegian king sagas, as I mentioned earlier, Snorri presumably explains that if skaldic poems are composed correctly and interpreted appropriately, they yield historical information. So that's a basis for understanding skaldic poetry and all of this as well. So his idea of what the skaldic poetry and to some extent also Eddic poetry actually tells us when it ventures into the realm of myth follows after his explanation of how skaldic composition works. He says, but these stories, as I mentioned, this is his sort of like his warning against believing in them. But these stories are not to be consigned to oblivion or demonstrated to be false, so as to deprive poetry of the ancient kennings which major poets have been happy to use. Yet Christian people must not believe in heathen gods, nor in the truth of this account in any other way than that in which it is presented at the beginning of this book. So that's presumably the prologue, where it is told what happened when mankind went astray from true faith, and after that about the Turks, how the people of Asia, known as Icia, distorted the accounts of the events that took place in Troy, so that the people of the country, that would be Scandinavia, would believe they were gods. So that's essentially his theory of how all of Nordic mythology works. And I just want to give a brief rundown of what the frame of the delusion of Gylfi then basically tells us in that context. So the frame is important for how we should understand the descriptions of Old Norse mythology in Snorri's Edda. So Snorri sets the tone for Old Norse mythology in its entirety in the prologue, where he explains that the gods were in fact humans who migrated from Troy. What Snorri is implicitly saying is, of course, that the pre-Christian Nordic religion that existed around these figures was based on delusion. Snorri postulates that when the Aesir had migrated to Sweden from Troy, this delusion was established through a particularly stupid king named Gylfi. He went to the Aesir and asked them many questions about the world, and this is how the stories about the gods came to Scandinavia, as lies or yarns told by these power-hungry foreigners and disseminated by a stupid king who fell for their tricks. Now, the first evidence of Gylfi's stupidity is this I mentioned before, the situation with Gevion. Snorri says that Gylfi allowed what he calls a certain vagrant woman named Gevion to settle on a piece of land. She asked Gylfi for as much land as 4 oxen can plow around in a day and night. He allows that, but then she goes to the north and copulates with a giant. She gives birth to 4 sons that she turns into oxen, and these oxen plow a considerable piece of land from Sweden, and this amazes Gylfi. Instead of angering him, he then decides to go to the Aesir and ask them these things, and he's skilled in magic and cunning, so he disguises himself as a traveler, and but they can of course recognize him, so they prepare these visions for him, and then they deceive him in different ways. Now, after he enters the hall that the Aesir resides in, this question-answer situation begins. The question-answer session about Norse mythology highlights what medieval Christians were concerned with rather than most important content of pre-Christian mythology in the way that non-Christians would have thought about their world. The first bits are concerned with the creations of the cosmos, the sun and the moon, and the creation of the center in the cosmos, possibly heaven. After that, we are told about the dwarfs, so the roots, the rivers and wells and its bottoms, and the Norns. We are also told about the animals that dwell in the tree, including where the winds come from. And after that, we have the subjects that, the subject turns to Odin as the Allfather, the divine controller, and the other gods. And when we get to Loki, we're told the story about the binding of the Fenrir wolf, and then we are told about the Ásatrúar, and we get a brief rundown of the story of Freyr and Gerda, and so on. This is basically recapping what I was just saying. So all of this eventually, especially the exploits with Thor and Balder and so on, this leads to the story about Ragnarök and the final interaction between the Aesir and Gylfi, where they then disappear in flashes, and all of these stories are disseminated across Scandinavia. So the story frame in the delusion of Gylfi represents Norse mythology as a set of stories that demonstrate the incompleteness of the gods. They fail at building a perfect world. They fail at building a proper protective rampart. Thor fails in Utgarður. Thor fails at catching the world serpent. Frigg and the gods in general fail at making Baldur immortal. Ultimately, the cosmos itself fails as Ragnarök occurs. And in the language of poetry, Snorri then provides an explanation for the stories as the Aesir tell them, basically that they are the Trojan War. Now, the story frame in the delusion of Gylfi, and also the frame in the language of poetry, exists to deny the veracity of Norse mythology and explain it all basically as delusions and lies. And it is built around the prophecy of the seeress, using that as a temporal frame. And then, of course, the question-answer style that we get it from Vathru and the sayings. So in that sense, it's postulating to be original. And that's really the most important conclusion I want to make about this material. When you're reading Snorri's Edda and you want to use it for understanding how people might have thought in pre-Christian times in Northwestern Europe, I think it's incredibly important to keep this in mind so that we understand exactly how this material is represented to us, and from there can sort of make our judgment of the different components that we are getting. There are some that I've mentioned already that are very obviously Snorri's own creations in different ways. For instance, his story about the creation of the world. But that doesn't mean that there aren't components of those stories that he's telling us that couldn't be original pre-Christian thought in different ways. And one of the things that I would point out is, for instance, the idea that the world is created from a primordial giant. That's a very widespread, very well-known myth that we find far beyond the realm of Christian Europe, for instance, and both spatially and temporally. So that's something to keep in mind. And there are multiple others, but I'm going to end my presentation here. And if you are interested in more of my ramblings, I do have a podcast that I do with a mate from Yorkshire. It's called the Nordic Mythology Podcast. So you're welcome to find it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and wherever else in the Nordic, the major outlets that you can find. So thank you so much for listening to me.
Thanks very much, Mathias, for such a complete, clear characterization of the contents. I'm sorry, here we got a feedback, but I hope that you're not hearing any feedback.
Just a bit.
Yeah. The slides were magnificent, and they really added to the great, thanks. I think the main point you made, which is very true, that no real religion is a religion of failures, and that is something that, as you rightly pointed out, Snorri seems to be keen to characterize Ásatrúar as. So in that sense, I think one must be distrustful of that. I'm sure, I hope people watching online and perhaps here as well will have questions. Does anyone, do I see any hands raised or anything, please? Oh, yeah, please go ahead, Mehran.
Thanks for wonderful presentation, very informative. I hope to see more of you later on. I want to know your explanation about the role of water and fire in the title of your work, and how we can relate that to the nature or the culture or both. I mean, you mentioned that men can turn to God, or God can turn to man. I don't know. This kind of transcendence, which is very important, very relevant to our time, and at the same time, your interpretation of the giants, is that nature power, or as many interpret as big tech, big biz, and those destroyers of this, earth?
Right, yes.
What's your take? Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting question. Yeah, no, so that's I think that really depends on how we choose to view each myth in its own particular context. For instance, I have this crazy idea that the story about Thor and Geirröður in Snorri's Edda is actually Snorri sending a narrative slight to his neighbor, because there is a neighbor of his who descends from a Geirröður, as I believe it's the only one in Iceland, in Borgarfjörður, where he had Egil Skallagrimsson's farm. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, that there might actually be that context for a story too.
May I interrupt with some other thing? You know, when you see the, Seri Vikings, you see that seer, the very creepy guy, and the remote viewing, beechcraft. You can see in the future, and people expect that you can see into the future. And maybe people had other abilities which are not, promoted in our societies.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a very short parenthesis, but we deal with completely other type of people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that's what we, for instance, see is that there is if you go to the prophecy of the seeress, you can see that the identity of the Völva who speaks as a presumed human being conflates with the identity of a supernatural being of some kind, what we would call a supernatural being. Possibly a Jötun, we're not entirely sure, could also be another type of so-called supernatural being. So they certainly had those ideas. And in the same way, it seems very clear to me that it was possible in their minds for humans to integrate with landscape. We see this with Barður Snæfellsás, a man who goes up under the Snæfellsnes glacier and becomes literally the Ás, the god of that glacier. We see this in multiple examples. In the same way, we also see a tendency to anthropomorphize natural features in different ways. That's what that's my personal theory on the subject of volcanism in Iceland, actually, that Nordic mythology has been used in different ways to talk about, not necessarily explain, but talk about volcanic phenomena. Surtur is, of course, the most famous version of this, because he's the well-known one, right? The fire sword that comes up from the ground. And rips the sky asunder and all of that stuff. That's a very good example of this anthropomorphization, but there's a lot of literature that does this in different ways. And there are even late folk tales in the 19th century that where we see, for instance, the glacial burst that comes on the Mýrdalsjökull, where the Katla fissure is located. They are caused by a witch named Katla. So there's a lot of that. and yeah, no, it's an entirely different way of seeing the world. And we, of course, nowadays we like to be rational about things. So we're caught in that.
May I ask one more thing? Did they think that the nature had a soul?
I think the way that they probably conceived of this was multiple persons. So for instance, you can interact with a tree or a rock or something like that, or a location, a full mountain perhaps too, right? That has a person or a personality. And if you ask me, you can still see traces of that in contemporary Icelandic culture in different ways. Like, you talk about Hekla or Katla as sort of persons in a way, right? So that's a possibility.
I'd like to ask can you mute it, Dirk, please? Thanks. Possibly the most contentious figure in the whole Edda is, I'm sure you know what I'm going to be asking, a figure for which there seems to be no solid evidence of any worship, archaeologically, or he doesn't seem to have any resonances in other cultures, namely Loki, but he's become a very popular figure in many circles. What's your view of him, and to what extent do you think he is the creation of Snorri?
So the way in which we see him acting in both the Edda and also in a poem such as Lokasenna, Loki's Quarrel, that is very much a creation, I believe, of the medieval period. I don't know if it's entirely Snorri's own creation, or it's it's something that exists on a basis of something older. Is Loki as a mythological figure, on the other hand, the creation of Snorri? I don't believe that. And that's because we can see narratives that are very similar to Loki-associated narratives, both before and after in European history. And we can casually throw Sirton from Caucasian folktales into the picture as an example of a similar Loki type figure. Prometheus is another one, and we find similarities with Finnish mythology as well. And another one that has famously been brought up is Lu from Celtic mythology, as possible sort of a similar type of trickster figures or gods even. So I don't think Loki as such is Snorri's invention, but I think the Loki that we know, so to speak, is
that was what I was meaning.
Yeah. I think another face of Loki, so to speak, more heroic one, is the one that we find in the Aslad stories in Norwegian and Danish and Swedish folktales. He's I believe it's Eldar Heide, a Norwegian scholar who has worked a lot with how the similarities between these folktales and Loki as a figure. That guy is more of like a folk hero, right? He's usually that lazy boy who's hanging out by the fire. That's hence the name Aslad, who doesn't really do anything with himself, and then all of a sudden he wakes up and becomes sort of a hero. He usually has he's usually part of three brothers, right? And the two other brothers are failures of various kinds, usually because they sort of like stick to the old rules, and then the Aslad shows up as the creative thinker. So there's also that aspect, and I think this mischievous, callous, evil figure is very much Snorri's invention more than anything else. And this is also so usually there's like a tendency to think of Eddic poetry as, and I also mentioned it, as sources to Snorri's material. And people tend to think of Eddic poetry as sort of a precursor to Snorri's mythology. That's not always the case in the material that we have available to us. Remember that the primary collection of Eddic poetry that we have, the Codex Regius, is written down after Snorri's Edda has been written. And it's very obvious that the redactor of the Codex Regius was familiar with Snorri's material. We can see how he sort of like organizes the poems in a progression that follows the timeline of Snorri's material. And also there are these prose explanations for what happens in the mythology here and there that hint at an understanding that is based off of Snorri's material. For instance, in Loki's Quarrel, there's the redactor writes this little prose epilogue to the poem, and sort of explains, after that Loki was captured and all of those things, and that's why He was tied in the underworld, and that's why we have earthquakes. That's almost verbatim the same thing as Snorri says. So that tells us that that we can't necessarily trust that the poems that we have available to us now are older than Snorri's material, and in that sense not also influenced by it.
One question that one of the people here would like to ask. Thanks, sir. Are there any modern fictional, imaginative accounts of the gods that do a better job, in your opinion, in bringing them to one's understanding than Snorri did?
That is actually a really good question. Because that also sort of, that goes in the direction of like what is better. I mean, Neil Gaiman's material, I feel is great fiction about the Nordic gods. That's my personal opinion. Whether he does a better job at getting to know them or letting us as readers get to know them, that's I think is a very individual question. I wrote a book on Norse mythology for kids, where I actually I tried to, in many ways, bring the material closer to what I believe is a more genuine understanding of the Nordic gods. But if you pick that up and you start reading it, you'll find that I've actually changed a lot compared to Snorri's original material. And in some cases, I've done it because it made more sense to refashion the story. And in other cases, I've done it because I can see through Snorri's material, and I can see where he went wrong based off of a skaldic poem I'm familiar with or something like that. Or I've simply just made a choice of saying, okay, there's Snorri's tradition, and then there's this other tradition that I find more compelling. That's what I've done, and you can criticize that a lot from like the idea of like an original text, and you can see similar ways in which early philologists, like from the 19th century, for instance, when they redacted the Eddic poems, sometimes they decided to split them up in many different versions, right? Hávamál famously is split up in 6 different poems. That's the choice of a redactor who thinks that they know better than the original, right? But notice that I'm using original in quotation marks, and that's because we're dealing with mythology, right? Mythology, from my perspective, is something that's still alive. It's not a sort of like a monument that just stands there and can never be touched. It's something that's supposed to be used, reused, and reproduced in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. All people that are part of the tradition have a right to extend the tradition according to their own conscience. And if what they say is really not very good, it doesn't resonate, then it will just fall away. And in that way, the tradition, like a tree, it will grow. It will set out branches, and if they're strong enough, they will live. And the metaphor is not that of a closed canon of words, as with the Abrahamic traditions. This is an organic religion, which is why it's closer to the nature of reality, I think. Does anyone else, Mikael or Linda? Oh, great, and Michael. I'm going to go on Moot. Linda, please go ahead, and then Michael after Linda's finished. Thanks.
Hiya. Hi, Mother. Could you, first of all, could you spell the name of the woman, the researcher who's doing the work into the Ashlad and the folk tales? Could you type her name in the chat for me, please?
Yes.
Thanks. But that wasn't my question. But if you type it in, Edda, thanks.
He's male.
Oh, I thought he was. Sorry. Well, him.
No worries.
His. But there was just one was a question and one was just a comment as well. I was at a conference this weekend on it turned towards animism. Rune was there and Josh. They gave some papers, but they brought together academics and practitioners, and there were quite a few women from family lineage in Iceland who were vulva or practiced Seder, but they were going not like the New Age kind. Their family lineage went back a long time, and there was a woman there called Ranveig who she's been going around Iceland and collecting waters. She's collected water from 120 different bodies of water, and she ingests the water, and then she works with the information given her through ingesting this water. And it was really interesting to see that her practice, you know, their sort of experiential practice, and that's nice about and she worked with stone as well, stone and water. But it was really interesting. But no, that was my question was, you mentioned about the picture stones. Now I'm quite familiar with the hogback stone in Haitian, which has got it's got Thor's fishing trip on. And there aren't that many in the UK or Ireland that are picture stones. A lot of them are just carvings. We've got some runes on stones and some early Anglo-Saxon carvings as well. But there aren't that many ones with actual stories on and pictures yet. In the northwest of England, you've got the Loki stone, so they've got a Loki, or what is interpreted as Loki, but also the only one that really tells a story from the Edda is the fish, is Thor's fishing story. And I just wondered, do you have any thoughts why that story seems to be so much more prominent to be told on the picture stones than others? You know, why would that have gone so widespread?
Yeah. So actually, half of my original PhD dissertation is kind of on this subject.
Okay.
My theory is that the story of Thor's fishing expedition, and you can criticize the story from many different angles. There are plenty who have suggested that it's actually sort of originally a Christian story. And then you always have to ask yourself, what does it mean that something is a Christian story, and when is it a Christian story, and when does it stop being a Christian story? All those things. And I'm not necessarily contesting that idea that it might have come from, Christian stories originally into Scandinavia. Who knows? Actually, I don't really care about it. What I care about is the significance it seems to have especially in what we'll call the Viking Age, right? From like 700 onwards. In the North Atlantic, generally the North Atlantic and Baltic realm, right? Defined more by the ocean than the land masses, because that's what's important to these people, right? We're dealing with a naval cultures, maritime cultures, that doesn't really matter whether we're talking about the Dutch coast, or we're talking about Scandinavia, or we're talking about the British Isles and Ireland. Like it's all maritime cultures defined more by their proximity to ocean than not, if you ask me. And that's where the story of Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent, in my opinion, becomes incredibly important, because if we start picking at the skaldic poems and also Snorri's narrative for that matter, what we find is actually a lot of details that have to do with dealing with water and relating to being on the ocean. One of the things that I point out is that, and this is of course my own interpretation, is that the Skaldic poems are very focused on the encounter between Thor and the serpent, like how they meet eye to eye. And what we learn in those versions is that the serpent spews eitur, is what is usually translated to poison, at him. The interesting thing is that that word can also mean ice. And that's a real danger when you're sailing around on a Viking ship in the North Atlantic. If the top of your ship is getting iced over, you'll capsize. So my suggestion is actually that we're dealing with a reference to a very physical element of sailing in the North Atlantic. That could be a real danger. And in the same way, it looks like Thor is actually, once we get just below that standard narrative of Thor in a wagon throwing a hammer around, we actually get to a god who sails a lot and is involved with a lot of wind on the ocean in general. There are plenty of examples in the saga literature where he sends ships off course. We have references in Dudo's history of the Normans to making rituals to Thor before sea journeys. So he's actually quite involved with that. And ultimately, I actually think that Thor, as a figure of mythology and belief in the Viking Age, was much more a figure that you would relate to in context of your Viking expedition in general. That's why he has that role of being you could call it a patron of warriors, sort of like the warriors who find themselves right there in the battle, whereas Odin seems to be more associated with those who are leading the battle. He doesn't partake in the fight, whereas Thor is right there in the front line, especially in Saxo's version of the story about Baldur's death, where Thor is the warrior. And he also has several epithets that hint at warriorhood, and also bears, for instance. So that could, generate a link to the Berserker mythology as well. And what it seems is that most of that stuff, the warrior stuff, is still present in Snorri's version of the mythology and in the Eddic poems. The traveling warrior, the warrior that goes on expeditions to fight enemies or protect the lands or whatever. But the sailing part has sort of dissipated a little bit. But you do find it here and there in hints in different ways. Again, I could probably talk a very long time about how Snorri is probably manufacturing a certain image of Thor again, and a certain image of Freyr, and a certain image of Njörður, where these images of Njörður as a sailing god could just as well be attached to Thor, if you ask me, and Odin for that matter as well. So that's part of why I think that the story of him fishing for the Midgard serpent is important, or so very important. It seems to be the most important story for these people who are traveling across the North Sea, right? They keep leaving images and references to it, right?
That's why I wondered, because it seems to be dotted everywhere, more so than any of the other stories.
I mean, if we are to believe Dudo, what you do is that you at the very least sacrifice some kind of goat or sheep to Thor before you get on your ship. But Dudo does say that it's humans.
I'm not doing that. Next time I go on the Irish ferry, I won't do that.
that's probably not a good idea.
It's not a good idea.
But ultimately, I mean, it looks like that's the first thing you do before you embark, right? You sacrifice to Thor, and then you go to different places, and you bring those ideas and thoughts with you, and that's how you end up, carving the image of that story on a hogback stone, right?
Thanks so much. Michael, I think you had a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Oh, it was a fascinating talk on a subject about which I know very little. I have a general question, I think. I was struck by the fact that you mentioned several times the role of Troy and the myth of Troy, and I just wondered where, in your opinion, or you probably not opinion, probably you know, lies the importance of Troy in so much of mythology. And there was a British group, I can't remember its name, that was convinced and was quite influential at the end of the 19th century that Britain originated in Troy and Britannia was some kind of Trojan symbol. And of course, we have the Aeneas, with the belief Aeneas was the founder of Rome, according to Virgil. So could you sort of briefly explain to me, how does this come about that what could have been a local fight between the Greeks and some branch of the Greeks, or not the Greeks, whoever they were, in Asia Minor, has played such an enormous role in pagan and Christian mythology? And then, of course, there's Dante as well, who has to be guided by Virgil through hell, heaven, and purgatory. It seems to me extraordinary. I just wondered if you can say something about that.
Charlemagne. It's Charlemagne.
It's Charlemagne.
Yes. So what we see is that post-Roman imperial collapse, right? We have all of these different, primarily Germanic tribes, but there are also other things in different ways, who are claiming to be the rightful heirs to Rome. And there are the Goths, for instance, in Italy and in Spain, and they pick up the origin story of Troy, thanks to the Aeneid, of course, and that's that they build an origin story around that, just like the Romans did, and Charlemagne does the same. If we can really talk about renaissances in literature and all that stuff, arts and so on in European history, he's the first, if you ask me, who to really kick a renaissance in play. He's the first to popularize Roman literature on the same level as we see it in the 1400s. And really make use of it, and he also has this claim: we originate from Troy. We Franks, we came from Troy, and it becomes, I believe, it is also part of Alfred the Great's ideology, and it becomes a standard trope. So in the 11 and 1200s, we see Scandinavians picking it up as well. And that's really why it's so important. Of course, the original founder of this mythology was the Roman Empire, but then it simply precipitates into cultures in Western Europe from there, and that's why I strongly doubt that many pre-Christian Scandinavian warlords or kings or whatever we want to call them labored on the same ideologies, but you can't rule it out either. And it's not impossible that some Danish magnate whose warrior had served down south somewhere had picked up this idea as well. But I think it's more a Christian ideology than anything else, and that's why we find it in context of Snorri's Edda, because Snorri is aware that pre-Christian Scandinavian kings and earls, they counted their origin from Odin, and possibly also other gods, but principally Odin. And since euhemerism is the main theory for understanding Nordic gods, that means that they're not gods, they're humans. then it's not a far leap from there to being like, well, they migrated from Troy, just like, you saw it in France, you saw it in Spain and in ancient Rome and so on. So that's where it comes from, if you ask me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Though, of course, not only Christian, because, of course, Virgil was pagan, but I take your main point, absolutely. It's interesting. I didn't know that about Charlemagne at all. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Excellent. Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks, Mathias. There is a question here. A gentleman wanted to make two comments. One, I think you've alluded to earlier, the fact that in a lot of royal genealogies, Odin is mentioned, and also Frey, I believe. But there's an interesting other point, Jeremy.
Oh, hi. Jeremy Morgan, ex-Oxford. Years ago, I studied quite a lot of strange things. One of them was the fact that because my father was a herald, I actually got to handle some of the medieval genealogies of the kings of England, and I found it very interesting as a 12-year-old boy, and I actually mentioned this to Professor Tolkien when we had a chat in the street, age 12. He was very kind, he talked to me about it, in which the biblical sort of Genesis mythology got all mixed up with Old Norse or Old English mythology. Edward II was a direct descendant not only of Adam and Eve, but also of Woden and Thor and so on. And I'm wondering whether that throws any light on the Snorri's Edda, which I did read about 50, 60 years ago. So I'm a bit rusty on it. The other thing I wanted to say was most people don't know this because, of course, we're only just beginning to work out how Etruscan sounded. You may not be aware of this because it's quite recent scholarship, that the Etruscans appear to have referred to their family of gods as Aesir or Aesir. Were you aware of that? I found that quite fascinating. I've seen a couple of articles on the web, but I'm not really a computer person. I tend to read books. And anyway, I'll just leave that with you. I've got quite a lot of other ideas, but they're, I'm an autodidact really, so I'm going to leave this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for those comments. First of all, yes, there is a direct relationship between the genealogies of the English kings, both before and after the introduction of Christianity, right? Well, not before. Mumbling. First, let me just start over. Yes, the Genesis is mixed with the genealogy, the pre-Christian genealogy, in the royal lines of most of these stories. Like we get it in England, and we definitely also get it in Scandinavia. Absolutely. That's the whole point. The idea that so in pre-Christian times, what we have is a king who legitimates his power by descent from Odin, or Woden in the English area. And then once we convert to Christianity, well, we have that issue. Well, we used to legitimize our power based off of descending from Odin, but now we got a new god. Well, what do we do with these old gods? Well, let's just turn them into humans. And that's how we then get a line of descent that starts with Adam and Eve, and at some point includes Odin, possibly Freyr, possibly a couple of the other gods, and eventually we get to me, right, as the current king, and that's where then the exodus from Troy becomes part of all of this. As I mentioned a couple of times, actually the reason Troy is usually the reason that Troy is chosen is that Troy is part of the center of the world. The center of the world is Jerusalem, and Troy is like right there in the proximity of that. And the assumption from the European perspective is that this is also somewhere over there we find the Garden of Eden. So that's why these Odin and his buddies from Asia, they can impress people in Scandinavia and in Western Europe in general. It's because he has all these riches and maybe even brought some olives, who knows? All those really cool things that we've heard about but never seen, right? As some scribe in a turf hut in Scandinavia somewhere, right? So that's part of the whole creation of this narrative of these gods as humans and the descendants of Troy or migrants from Troy. It's also convenient because in that way we can explain these non-Christian myths and stories and beliefs as something that comes from the outside. They weren't originally ours. They weren't our mistakes. They were the mistakes of those people who came from Troy, which was also used. Like that was also part of the whole narrative. I would really like to see those articles on the Etruscan language, and that sounds really fascinating. So if you have a title for me, I would be happy to hear it.
Thanks. I'll try and get some reference from Jeremy, and I can forward it to you, Mathias. I know I've come across the same as well. Yeah, so I'm sure it's out there. And please give me a reference, perhaps to your children's book, which sounds excellent. Is that in Danish or English?
English.
Okay, excellent. I think if no one has any more... Oh, Mikhail has a question. All right, I think this will be the last question.
Yeah,
Mikhail,
I wanted to go last.
ahead.
So it's more of a remark, maybe even a critique. I've written it down, so I will read it. So I have to disagree on one point in the talk and in the discussion, because I find it, which I find to be an incorrect understanding of human psychology. That is the understanding of the creative process of man, especially when composing poetry. Psychologically, I would believe that the creative process itself is trans-individual. That means that there is no awareness of an intention that is mine, personal, that drives the creative process. Therefore, the creative process itself does not have itself a goal to interpret the mythical world. You said that. Because that would be a goal of the individual. It is in a way that the artist is in a way possessed by a trans-individual entity that drives the creative process itself, right? And after this creative process ends, we can logically interpret the poem and acquire better understanding of the mythical world. Well, your position had the opposite causal relation, right? I'll give you a specific example. I had my own rune casting, and it was done. I did it on the 16th of April. And I had no idea what this prophecy meant, but I will read it to you. And it was this sentence. It is the year of the Lord of the Sword. In it, a busty woman will give the serpent a blazing skull of a horse. And just yesterday, I had no idea what that meant. I mean, since interesting anyway. It was done in a very composing, in a poetic way. And yesterday, I was reading Homer. I was reading the Hymn to Demeter by Homer. And in it, Persephone is described as a deep-bosomed daughter of Demeter, who is abducted by Hades, right? And Hades is a chthonic deity, which is connected with the serpent, right? With snakes, which is the god of the underworld. And in it specifically, there is talked about a deathless or undead. I think I looked at the specific Greek word. The translation is dark veiled horse. So that's like a very interesting thing, you know. Like I wrote this 3 months ago. I didn't know what it meant, but I found the logical interpretation of the mythical world where we could understand this prophecy. I don't
And
know. Thoughts?
what's my theory on the creative process?
Well, you sort of said it multiple times. You know that I think we have to distinguish multiple creative processes. I think there's more than one, and there's more of them. Of course, I think you can have, in a way, an invention, because in invention and poetry is not the same thing. It's a different creative process. The inventive creative process and the poetic creative process is definitely different, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what the Greeks analyzed, right? They had techne, the technological, inventive creative process, and poiesis, the artistic creative process,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. What we have here is an author. His name is Snorri Sturluson, right? And he gives us his thoughts. He tells us very clearly what he thinks about poetry. That's what I replicated. I haven't really said much about what I think goes behind the creative process in skaldic poetry, right? Because
I would talk about in general,
that's
right?
a very interesting discussion. Like, how does for instance skaldic poetry, how is that created?
In poetry in general, right?
Yeah, in poetry in general, for that matter. If you go to skaldic poetry and you look at how they talk about it, and also, of course, read Snorri's myth on the origin of skaldic poetry, it is a very, very interesting and in many ways similar process as you're describing. What we're dealing with is the origin story of poetry, right? And Snorri's version is that we have a man who's made from fluids, and then he's turned into fluids, right? And then by drinking these fluids, you receive knowledge of the cosmos. Notice that in that story about the meat of poetry, what Kvasir does is that he travels through the entire cosmos before he becomes liquid in the underworld with the dwarves. And so what this really tells us is that when you are metaphorically or physically, I guess, imbibing of that wisdom drink, then you are partaking in a knowledge of the cosmos that is inherently numinous or mystical, right? I think that goes very much along the lines of that creative process that you're talking about. But what Snorri is doing is that he's intellectualizing all of this, breaking it down in the Christian framework that he's dealing with, and in so many ways also materializing it. Where, you know, in some cases it was probably, in my opinion, and this is me not speaking so much as a scholar, but somebody who is spiritually invested in this material as well. In some cases, this material wasn't meant to be understood concretely in the ways that Snorri, for instance, discerns it, or these later scholars, some of my colleagues for that matter, because they, in many cases, they just rest on this Snorrian tradition. And then they take it even further in terms of making it devoid of any metaphorical, allegorical, metonymic, or in any other way additional meaning, right?
Metaphysical,
So
right?
Yeah, metaphysical, yeah. For instance, if you look up some of the Haitian kennings that are listed in the index for the Snorri's Edda in modern editions and translations, what they do is that you can have a pretty elaborate kenning, and then it'll just tell you, oh, it's a giant, right? But that's not really what the reality that the kenning is establishing. The kenning is combining multiple elements that create their own reality in and of themselves, right? So reducing that to simply giant is, you know, violates, in my opinion, violates the original material.
I agree.
But you know, this is the complicated discussion between what we also talked a little bit about before, you know, wanting to be rational about things, and then also having a spiritual realization about the world, right?
Yeah.
And you know, it really depends on what space we can go into. At the university, I can't give you.
Yeah, you can't go into the magical mythical space, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Of course.
But
Which is a shame in many ways, you know.
It is. And it's also problematic because it does actually take something away from the reality, if it cannot be experienced from the spiritual. But I think what we need for the future is to be able to establish spaces where it's possible to do that in a way that can also communicate with the more rationalistic approach, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah. Thanks for the comment.
Yes, thanks very much for helping to make this one of those spaces to some extent, Mathias, which I hope it will continue to be. I think it's very apt that perhaps we do finish with the mention of Kvasir and the Mead of poetry, which is one of the most tangible ways in which we can have a sense of the being of the gods. So I think I'd like to thank you very much, Mathias, for your considerable learning in answering a very wide range of questions for the slides and for the patience with which you dealt with the technical problems at this end. So yeah, I think everyone will be very grateful for the time, and so yeah, please send any information about your works to me, and I can forward it to people in the group, and I think we'd all be very pleased with that. Now I will end with Havamal. At kveldi skal der gløyfa, kono brend maki rønde moe givine, ise ivekemme, øl drukket og at not skal kveld gløyfa. At evening shall one praise the day, and at night shall one praise the evening. Sigur either, sigur os. Thank you very much, Mathias, so much, and thanks to everyone who has persisted with the initial problems, who's kept to the end, who's asked questions. I thank you all from my heart, and I wish everyone a very good evening or day, wherever you're happening to be viewing this. But I shall be hopefully posting this on the YouTube channel later this evening when I get home. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
May the gods be with you. Bye bye.
Thank you.